as you know, today, Prime Minister was at Gangaikonda Cholapuram to commemorate, celebrate the birth anniversary of Rajendra Chola II, first, sorry, as well as the 1,000 years of his naval expeditions. Now, there is much to learn from the Chola dynasty and their prowess, but I want to first ask you to set the context of why it's so important for us to remember Gangaikonda Cholapuram and Gangaikonda Chola, as Rajendra Chola I was called. What was possibly the most significant aspect of that king?
Of course, Rajendra Chola was one of the great kings of southern India. He had not only conquered much of the southern tip of India, but also his empire extended into the Maldives, much of Sri Lanka. And he also made a number of raids, some naval raids into Southeast Asia, but also he led an expedition all the way through to the Ganga on near the Bihar-Bengal border. So he was a great conqueror. The economy of southern India flourished under him, mostly through maritime trade. It was a period of great achievement in terms of architecture and art and so on. So he was quite a character. But I think the really interesting part about him is about celebrating him is not just about Rajendra Chola himself. You see, the point is that celebrating historical characters and great kings of India like Rajendra Chola is actually a way of recalibrating the way we think of Indian history itself.
Interesting that you say that. And when you say that, what's perhaps the big lesson to be learned now? Because one doesn't miss the symbolism of it all, that the Prime Minister flies in from Maldives to Tuticorin and then has this event at Gangaikonda Cholapuram. It's perhaps something that we can learn majorly from our history in terms of present-day strategic interests and diplomacy.
Well, the main thing to learn from this is this. You see, we Indians tend to think of our long civilizational history in a very peculiar way that has almost imbibed colonial era tropes. So somehow you get the impression from our textbooks or even normal conversations that Indians over time were somehow very passive people, that maybe we did some great philosophical debates, perhaps invented chess, but otherwise we were very passive and mostly sitting around waiting for invaders to take us over to inject some kind of vigor into us. So this is where you get these kinds of tropes. Mughals gave us biryani and the British gave us railways, so we should be eternally grateful to them and effectively celebrate our own subjugation. So the point here is to show that we had our long history is much better understood as a much more vigorous people. The same people who were building the temples were also doing these great naval expeditions to other extremes of the world. They were writing poetry. These are the same people who were, building a great economy. I mean, we are very proud of ancient India being, 1/3 of the world economy. Well, the people who built it were not sitting at home, sort of contemplating and meditating only, but actually going out there and doing vigorous things, which is a real, upside down view of how we normally perceive Indian history. So it is important that we celebrate these very active, vigorous sort of history that we have in this way.
No, interesting that you say this. As a South Indian, for instance, Ponniyin Selvan of Maniratnam was just released, which is about the Chola dynasty. As a South Indian, as a Tamilian, I've heard stories and stories and stories of the Chola greatness. There are two aspects here. One is when we celebrate Indian kings, somewhere I think kingdoms like Cholas or the Pandyas from the southern regions don't get that kind of national importance that we've had before. So one is about establishing that. But more importantly, from Peninsular India's point of view, it's about the maritime expansions. It's about the influence in the Indian Ocean region. And that was also a very interesting aspect, whether it was Sri Lanka, whether it was Cambodia, the Cholas sending their fleets out there to establish India's influence there in the Indian Ocean region.
In fact, at least the Cholas are better known. We have a very long maritime history going back all the way to the Harappan period, the Bronze Age. the Cholas are actually fairly late in history. Even if you were celebrating just the state of Tamil Nadu's history, you would probably have to go earlier into, for example, the Pallavas, who were perhaps even more
Absolutely.
vigorous in terms of the explorations of Southeast Asia and so on. So the point is that we have simply not celebrated. I mean, it's not just southern India. I mean, this is true of all of the rest of India. Whether you of the Ahoms of Assam or the Pal dynasty and the Sens of Bengal or the Kadambas of Goa or the Chalukyas of Maharashtra and the Rashtrakutas, we all have amazing histories for every part of the country. But somehow we are obsessed with this Delhi-centric view that, we should all be grateful to the Mughals for biryani.
Mughals for biryani, of course. I wonder what the
Which,
Cholas had.
by the way, is not even true, because you have to understand the Mughals came from Central Asia, where it is dry. They are basically wheat-eating, horse meat-eating people. They didn't even have rice in Central Asia.
Right. You make an interesting point there, a nuanced point there. I wonder what the counter to the biryani was amongst the Chola during the Chola times. We don't know that. But, in terms of India's own soft power, the cultural soft power, this is the legacy that we're talking about, especially, and I bring back focus to the Indian Ocean region per se, where, at the moment you have the Chinese influence and India needs to combat that as well. Is there a specific lesson that we can take from the past, which was about, let's say, whether building temples or spreading the culture or taking Indian culture abroad to these island nations in the Indian Ocean?
Yes, I mean, in fact, as I said, I'm glad the Cholas are being celebrated. But I do want to point out that the Cholas were only one of such peoples. I mean, just like I said, even Tamil Nadu itself has many other, the Pandyas, the Cheras, which are from next door in Kerala, the Pallavas, as I mentioned. And then you have the Gajapatis and all the kings of Kalinga, who also had these great maritime linkages to Southeast Asia. The western coast of India has amazing history of links with the Roman Empire and so on. So this is a long history where you see the influence of that is enormous. I mean, Indonesia, for example, is a country that names itself after India. Its national symbol is the Garuda, Vishnu's vehicle. Right now, you have a war going on between Thailand and Cambodia, which is over a Shiva temple. So these are things that are alive. You read Korean history as taught to them in their textbooks, which is their history starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. And yet, we do not teach all of this in our history books. I mean, forget history books. It's not even there in too many books. I mean, I'm not a historian. I got so frustrated with all of this that I began to write my own books about all of this. And as many of you may know, I'm currently in the process of, I've just finished designing and then building with the help of the Navy a ship from the 4th century, a stitch ship with no nails involved. And we are hoping to sail this to Oman later this winter. But the point I'm making is it's very important to understand that, we were a people with vigor. There was a culture of risk-taking and adventure that really is a part of that. So, we love to read ancient epics or, chant ancient mantras and so on. But if you want to truly understand those epics, the mantras, the Puranas and so on, then you need to understand those people who wrote it. And those people were not sitting at home contemplating the world. They were getting on their ships and exploring the oceans. They were climbing the Himalayas. They were doing intellectual experiments into, the nature of the universe. So these were vigorous, risk-taking people. Happy to go to war with each other sometimes, or with foreign invaders. But the point is, these were not a passive people. And instead, the only person in our history of our, pre-Islamic history that we celebrate is Ashoka. And the only reason we celebrate him is because he was passive, because the empire collapsed under him.
So you're saying the pacifist angle. It's an argument that you're making. My last question to you, sir, reclaiming this as part of India's national strategy today, when you have events of this nature, when we reclaim much of this maritime history and this legacy that we've had as part of national strategy today, it's not just folklore, it's also about sending out a very strong message to perhaps another generation to come.
Yes, I mean, we need to be aggressive in protecting our interests. I mean, why did Rajendra Chola go there to Southeast Asia in the first place? You should know the history of this. What basically happened is the Srivijaya kings of the Sumatra had basically taken control of both the main routes to China. One was the Malacca Strait and the Sunda Strait. The Sunda Strait typically used to be controlled by the Javanese royalty, but they had been defeated by the Srivijaya and pushed out. So essentially, the Sumatrans ended up with a monopoly on the route and began to impose very heavy tariffs. Now, the Sumatrans had been backed in this by, interestingly, by the Chinese Song Empire to do all of this. So I think the Sumatrans were quite confident that they would continue to be able to heavily tax Indo-Chinese trade. Now, in 1017, Rajendra Chola actually sent a warning to the Srivijaya saying that, what they were doing was extractive and they shouldn't do that. But then later on, in 1025, they set out with a much bigger fleet, which, by the way, would have been funded by these huge mercantile guilds that were part of the... So remember that the trade was not done by individual merchants. They were done by these huge mercantile guilds who had their own navies. And they set off from Nagapatnam, which was the main Chola port. They swung way across to Southeast Asia, and there they defeated the Srivijaya. They first sacked a bunch of their ports and then defeated them in Kedah. Kedah is now in Malaysia, in the Malay Peninsula. And so after that, they came back. So very important to understand that this was not an invasion of conquest by the Cholas. The Cholas never conquered Southeast Asia. What they wanted to do was to keep the trade channels open. And that is why they did that. And after that, it's very interesting. We have a record of a joint embassy by the Cholas and the Srivijaya to the Song court, suggesting that now, the channels had been opened up. And interestingly, the Chinese did not support their ally, the Srivijayans, during this entire episode. So it appears that the Chola had some sort of an understanding with the Song Empire during this whole thing. So what I'm trying to say is that we do have a long history of acting outside of our subcontinent when protecting our economic interests.
As a national power, an international power in the Indian Ocean region, it's not something that's new to India's concept. But sir, my final question to you as I let you go. Today, as you saw the Prime Minister there at Gangaikonda Cholapuram, what do you think is the big message that's come out?
That first of all, we need to begin to relook at our history and think about our great ancestors as a vigorous people. They built great temples, they built entire new cities when necessary. When they needed to, they would protect their interests. So this is a much more vigorous view of ourselves than, we are waiting for somebody to conquer us and give us the railways.